Welcome to the FYI by Find Your Influence. My name is Chelsea Goodson. I'm the head of creator economy here at Find Your Influence, and I'm really excited to be having this conversation with you all today. We're focusing on how to negotiate with brands and influencers. Some of the topics we'll be covering are value propositions, setting clear objectives, contract essentials, and so much more. I'd love to dive right into our panelist introductions. First is Sam Katz. Sam is a New York City-based marketer and talent manager, founder of Crowdwork Media, and an influencer marketing and talent management agency, excuse me. But Sam, I'd love to kick it over to you and have you share a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you very much. As Chelsea said, Sam Katz here, coming out of Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And for lack of a better word, I've been an agency person for the last just under a decade, focused on the intersection of performance media and working with creators or influencers. And about a year and a half ago, I founded Crowdwork Media, where we represent some of the most unique and engaging athletes and artists, a lot of the times based in New York, but across the country.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sam. Our next panelist is Katie Plattner. Katie is also a New York City-based entrepreneur, investor. She's the founder of ABOVE&BEYOND, a talent hub that represents creators, mega influencers, and celebrities. Katie, I'd love to kick it over to you and have you share also a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you, Chelsea. And just wanted to also thank Samantha Lay, who helped put all of this together, and the rest of the Find Your Influence team. Really appreciate the inclusion. I've done panels, I've spoken at Adweek in front of people, but I've never spoken on a virtual panel before. So it feels weird just looking at 4 people, but hi, everyone who's probably somewhere in the ethos. So, my career started really at Viacom, where I was overseeing budget reconciliation for short form, long form movie events, like Kids' Choice Awards. And that was really when I first was exposed to talent earnings, whether that was actor, event appearance fees, song royalties. I then went on to lead multi-million-dollar events for Fortune 500 and international brands like Spotify and Havas. And this was where I really started negotiating the heck out of deals, whether it was with vendors or talent. And then I moved on to lead campaigns, influencer specific, for amazing brands like T-Mobile, Church & Dwight, Hunter PR, you name it. I've worked on activations with top celebrities like Alicia Keys, Normani, Rehab, and of course, everything from micro, mid-tier, macro, social celebrities. But I think the biggest thing I like to share is that I love the relationships that I hold on the talent side. And that's really what's drawn me to where I am today.
Well, thank you. That is beautiful. I feel like I obviously know you well, Katie, but now I've learned even a little bit more. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Of course. And then last but not least is Noah King. He is the CEO and co-founder of Popsixle, a data platform for Shopify brands. Noah, I'll kick it to you.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, super excited to be here. Lots of respect for the other panelists, and really excited to get into some details here and hopefully have a really productive conversation. But yeah, I'm also, as Sam said, kind of an agency guy. I've been working in marketing for quite a while. Started off on the creative agency side, worked at Havas running a paid social team, and was sort of a buyer of influencer data and products and activations. Now at Popsixle, we are a data business. It's a software company, but really such a key part of the negotiation is how do you create value and then quantify the value? And then hopefully, different stakeholders are keeping some of that value. So yeah, again, super excited to have this conversation and hopefully can bring a little data spin to things.
Yes, definitely. Well, we appreciate you all. So grateful to have you today, and thank you all for sharing more about yourself. A couple of housekeeping items. I just always like to call out that all attendees' cameras are off and microphones are muted, so no worries there. Our Q&A chat is open throughout the duration of the conversation, and we encourage you to submit your questions toward the end of the conversation. We'll be jumping into those, so please get them in early. We would love to answer those toward the end. But for outside of that, our conversation today is going to be more so a bit of a roundtable. We have some really exciting questions planned out, and looking forward to just jumping right in. Our kind of topic to start things off is value proposition. And I will say, Katie and Sam, I'm kind of looking at you on this one, but as talent managers, how do you articulate the value of talent to brands? And what key pieces do you often spotlight to them?
I'll jump in on that one. So I think when it comes to how do you create this interest, or how do you create this value between brands and creators, it's really all about how can you build leverage. And to me, it's all about, can we answer the question, why should this brand pay us, and why should they pay us now? Which I think is really difficult in a world where there aren't necessary, specific tent poles around a creator's business. So part of my job is helping them build those tent poles. That could be projects that they have coming down the pipe. It could be different programs that they're taking part in, like a marathon, and they're releasing a training program around it. By giving this like really good value and ideas, we can build that leverage and the urgency when talking to these brands. So it's not just, hey, let's do a post and whenever it happens, it happens. It's a very specific idea with room for creativity and collaboration. There's a timeline associated with it and some initial rates so we can get the ball rolling.
Yeah, awesome. Katie, feel free to jump in there, but I would love to hear your perspective too. Oh, I think you're on mute. So sorry.
Hi. To Sam's point, I think there are, base things we need to establish before even getting into the talent nitty-gritty, which is what type of activation are they planning around? As a talent manager, founder, agent, whatever you really are to represent talent, typically you come at the downstream, you're like the last stop in the planning. And so you have to recognize that when you're invited into the conversation. And so, based on that, you can then look at the talent specifically. And I think understanding the type of marketer you're working with. So, more traditional marketers, they'll look at talent as just a line item in a massive production or budget. Whereas maybe a more influencer-centric, digital savvy marketer might look at them as almost like a media play in themselves. And so understanding that from the top is super important. And then, understanding what they're trying to accomplish. So when we look at a celebrity, for example, you'll want to consider their cultural relevance, their accolades, their press, the things that really hold value for that high ticket item. And so does that celebrity, for example, personally drive and embody the brand? Whereas an influencer's value can be completely different. And so are you looking at their performance, the platforms they exist on, their follower count, all of the metrics involved, in addition to their personal their personality that they're putting out there, and the type of content? Is it self-shot content? Are they great for productions in front of a set and camera? So all of these things just from the top need to be weighed in when you're understanding what value the talent holds.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are both great points. I feel like you both highlighted a full kind of array of, from metrics to more of like that awareness play in terms of like who they are, like you said, what cultural relevance do they have, kind of what's going on with them in the media right now. We're going to dive into some key metrics conversations in terms of our influencers and brands here in a second, but kind of to tie that all together, Noah, I thought I'd come to you talking about like the metrics and kind of this whole conversation. What metrics do you feel are often, overlooked by influencers, but are highly valued by brands? So that could be within these like early conversations, or even when we're kind of in the mix of things already, and we want to be aware of them as we continue to drive the conversation with any campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, attribution and measurement is not an easy problem to solve. And I think that, you could run 100 different influencer campaigns and maybe you'd see a very wide range of what could be measured, from the low end to the high end. So I'll just sort of share a couple snapshots. I feel like, table stakes at the low end is something around reach. So just being able to say, I have X many followers, I posted this piece of content, it reached Y many people. That would be kind of your base level. I think just from a reach perspective, Katie made a really good point that, your brand already has a certain following. Tapping an influencer, you're essentially getting incremental reach to new people. So it'd be really ideal. This would be a lot harder to measure, but to not just say, oh, I reached 100,000 people, but I reached 100,000 people in this demographic of this type. And ideally, those are the people that the brand wanted to reach. So the media buyer on the brand side could say, great, we spent this money on this campaign hoping to get incrementality to this cohort that we don't normally reach, and we've clearly achieved that goal. So that's sort of like the reach dimension. I think moving further down funnel, you'd probably want to see engagement. So if you tap an influencer and they say, oh, normally my posts get a 2% engagement rate, well, did this post get 2.3% or 1.4%? Or, is there some sort of reference point and benchmark, and there's an expectation that's set when you're negotiating? And then was that expectation met in actuality? I think that would be kind of the engagement side. Again, I mentioned engagement rate. It might be sentiment analysis. Not everyone has access to that, but like now you're not just looking at scale, you're looking at quality.
Right.
And then depending again on the activation, hopefully you can tie it all the way back to revenue. So again, it depends. If you're using a coupon code, like that would potentially show sales. If there's other attribution built in, hopefully you can show not only do we get reach, not only do we get engagement, it actually turned into revenue. Now we can quantify a return on investment.
Yeah, awesome. I appreciate you sharing that. You hit on so many great points there. And I know the revenue piece, that conversion is huge. And we've definitely seen a shift over the past couple of years in terms of what that looks like, moving away, I think, from a lot of awareness into conversions. But you also hit on a point about engagement rate. And Katie, I thought I'd come to you. How can influencers effectively demonstrate their engagement rate? And why do you think that's crucial for a brand?
Yeah, I think to kind of tie it back to the initial question and Noah's points, in the negotiations process, once you understand the goals of the brand and you're looking to showcase, key points about that talent to get it across the finish line, whether it's engagement rate or ultra awareness or high click-throughs, whatever it is that's their key thing. I have a creator who is averaging 15 times his follower count on his IG reel views, right? So that's clearly a wow factor that you should be showcasing up front. So whether it's a reach or engagement rate, making sure you're presenting those facts up front in the negotiation is super important. Noah mentioned a little bit about like tech that's behind the scenes. You don't really know what tech marketers are looking at. Sometimes they'll show you engagement rates and you're like, well, I have the first party data and that's actually not at all what I have. So, making sure that you're aligned even up front on those engagement rates. And, I think I got a little bit off topic there, but I think, when it comes to engagement rates specifically, driving that quality. So showcasing comment sentiment, taking screenshots, doing that little bit of extra work on the talent front goes so much farther. And I always think about what does an internal person at a brand agency or a brand want to pass up the LOB to showcase to the rest of their team. And so if you have that awesome screenshot where they've mentioned that exact product before, or even the brand specifically, like that is such a nice little nugget that they can pass along internally to help see your talent across the finish line.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, I was gonna ask you next in terms of your thoughts on this too. So glad to see you chiming in.
I'd love to yes and both those points because I think they're both super important. For me, the qualitative side of data in the social sphere or influencers, it could be like a gift and a curse. But I think creators should be able to use it to their advantage as opposed to the opposite. So for example, if you have a lower engagement rate, how do you use anecdotal evidence to say, my audience is engaged, they love what I'm doing, and without attribution tools, how can you show that people really liked what you're talking about? So maybe you're showing click-throughs from your stories, or you're showing, as Katie mentioned, screenshots of people saying, oh my God, I just bought 3 of these for my whole family. And so you get a really good response in the content. Maybe sometimes those comments are negative, but it's product feedback or it's campaign feedback. So as a creator, how do you then pass that info back to the brand or the agency as a way to hopefully optimize and keep that conversation going? The example I use, I'm typically a hater of engagement rates, and I know that it is like a baseline check. I could hate it from the math side of like, let's pick the numerator, let's pick the denominator and have a conversation of like, what are we doing here? The other reason I don't like it is I think you need those qualitative data points to qualify that engagement. So who would you rather work with? Someone with a 40% engagement rate of everyone commenting like, I hate you and you're the worst and I would never do anything, or someone with 10 comments saying, oh my God, this just changed my life. I'm going to the store now. So I don't think it tells the full story, which is why I'm a hater of it. I am not hater of how do we increase engagement, or how do we get people and create those sort of ways for people to engage so you can show brands or agencies or whoever, look at my audience, they care.
Yeah.
I'd love to add on to that for a minute. I think having a bit more of an out of the box approach to engagement, because ultimately creator engagements can live off of the channels that a brand might even be considering. So if you can showcase their audience's affinities that live within their broadcast channels or even newsletter subscribers, how many of their deepest fans are going to pay for their content through a paywall or Patreon. Like, these are all the things that maybe don't directly hit the benchmarks that someone's quickly checking off. But again, driving that qualitative feedback around why these engagement rates look the way they do and other supportive information, I think is just so important if someone truly cares about the creator that they're trusting with their brand.
Yeah.
I totally agree. And the one thing that I think maybe is counterintuitive is, in any negotiation, you want to create a win-win. And I'm projecting here, but I would assume the creator themselves, the influencer themselves, is saying, man, every time I post, I have a 2% engagement rate. If I talk about this brand and it's only a 1%, I'm losing my equity. I'm losing my credibility.
Right.
So to create a win-win, you almost need to have an accountability that says, look, the more you work with our brand, it's good for you. It's good for business. And like, that's a quality score with the creator, again, playing the long game, thinking about the long-term relationship. They're going to say, this is great. I want to keep working with this brand. This is good for my business. So slightly counter way of thinking about it, but it's, again, a quality metric that could potentially document that a win-win occurred.
Yeah. I feel like that really flows nicely. I mean, we've got so many questions in front of us, and I feel like this conversation is flowing in such a perfect way. So I kind of want to jump around a bit, but to Noah, to that regard, you bring up a great point. I'd be curious to hear your perspective of how do brands really measure the effectiveness of an influencer's engagement rate? You were kind of speaking to it there, but is there anything more that whether it's another brand or an influencer should be aware of in terms of how that perception is or what they should be considering?
I'm sure we'll hear a range of opinions, but the way I think about it, wearing like my media buyer hat, is basically every investment I make, I need to have some comparable currency so that I can compare, I spent money here on an out of home ad. I spent money here on an influencer partnership. I spent money here on a Google campaign. How do I say, what do I scale up? What do I scale down?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the ultimate, like, you need to be able to compare apples to oranges to, mangoes, and be able to decide what worked. Yeah. My personal feeling is the best potential measurement plan is one that's multidimensional. So I often think of quality, scale, and efficiency. Mm-hmm. Am I saying that right? Yeah. So quality would be like the engagement rate, did it create a win-win? Is there some measure that shows not just the number of people who participated, but like, the quality of their experience? Mm-hmm. Then you have your scale-based metrics, which are totally a separate dimension. You might have had great quality, but not a lot of it. Or you might have massive scale, but something else is missing. And then the efficiency piece is sort of the dollars in, return out. Mm-hmm. So again, as a media buyer, even if, I spend $50K on an influencer campaign and I can't necessarily tie it back to revenue, I might be comparing that $50,000 investment to another option I forego. So somehow I need to be able to say, was this efficient? Would I do this again? Are these dollars working hard for my business, or are they better put elsewhere? So that's more of like the framework.
Yeah.
And again, it just really depends on what's possible. So depending on if the influencer is willing to share screenshots from the in-platform metrics, if they're using tech that enables certain things to be measured, that can be really valuable. Or again, if there is some way to attribute back to revenue with a coupon code or a microsite or whatever else it might be. There's so much range, but hopefully at a high level that kind of outlines some of the approach.
Yeah, absolutely. One other quick question that ties into that nicely. What kind of level of engagement, so we're talking specifically engagement rate, do brands like to see when they're considering someone to be, a good fit or not a good fit, but not the best for this activation? Is there a certain number they should be looking for, or like
Yeah.
kind of like tie back into those three buckets?
I mean, I wouldn't say quote me on these numbers, but in general, like an engagement rate of less than 1% is generally low.
Sure.
If you get 1 to 2%, that's pretty typical. Over 2%, I think would be very high.
Yeah.
And in general, with anything with marketing, it's like you start off very broad. That's why we call it a funnel. It tapers down. So long as you're not getting massive drop off, I would think that 1 to 2% is probably a pretty decent rule of thumb, but it really depends on, is it a low interest category? If you're doing an influencer campaign for a pharmaceutical drug, an insurance company, a bank, like you're never going to get an engagement rate over 1%. If you're selling, awesome sneakers to CrossFitters, you might hit 5%. So it just has to do with how relevant and high interest the category is.
Yeah, absolutely. Not to kind of flip things around, but Katie and Sam, if you had anything that you wanted to add there, I think it's great always to have the, both sides of the perspective. And if you guys have engagement rates that you look to hold your talent to.
I would.
No, something I've noticed recently is like TikTok is higher. So I guess that has to do with the discoverability and the idea that, you can bring in outside audiences to also engage in your content. So I've been hearing numbers thrown out like 8 to 10 on TikTok even recently, which is definitely high, but something some buyers have mentioned. And then, 3 to 4, I would say, is kind of a sweet spot on Instagram. And so, but again, it goes back to what we were talking about initially, that Sam hates engagement rates and, is a buyer only judging on that? Well, then there's more to the conversation, but that's kind of where I've been hearing whispers of these days.
Yeah.
And look, I could hate it all day, but that doesn't change the fact of the matter is like, that's usually the number somewhere in the like high up in the hierarchy of how brands or agencies are looking at creators in a quick way. Oh, they have over 2%. Great. We'll put them on the list. If they don't, we're not even going to look at them further. So there is this like precursory check, like, yes, engagement has to be high. I don't know if there is a number. 2% seems to be one that's thrown around as like industry average. Who knows if that's made up or not. But again, like I think that's one shortcoming of the influencer industry as a whole is like, if you look at TV, if you look at other channels, they have media mix modeling to prove out these TV ads drove people in store or something like that, where it's all theoretical, it's based in numbers, but they are able to point to it and say, look, this was valuable. There's a couple places where that exists in the influencer space. In affiliate marketing, really good at that because you can really see the attribution. Other than that, I think it's really difficult to find like some consistencies. Every agency, every brand using this measurement for their influencer marketing. There is no Nielsen of influencer marketing just yet.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Well, goodness, I mean, I'm again looking at the questions in front of me and we are just knocking them out left and right. But in terms of kind of, following from here, we've talked a lot about, metrics, engagement rate. I'd love to talk about kind of objectives, what are the baselines for the campaign? And Katie, I was wondering if you could share some common objectives that you typically see and, kind of get an idea of how they influence the negotiating process for you.
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest things from a talent side point of view that you need to ask yourself going into a negotiation is, how scarce is this creator for this program?
Okay.
And so looking at several things, one low-hanging fruit is the niche of the creator. If I represent a dermatologist or a nurse, someone who's a professional, scarce, niche, they're working long days to find a creator who also is holding an incredible level of content and performance online is not the easiest thing in the world, versus a lifestyle or beauty creator. So that can indicate, how hard you can go in the paint with your negotiations sometimes. And then also like understanding, the objective of the buyer based on their industry. So I read something I read something recently that the highest CPA of any, of all industries is automotive. So I think, auto marketers are being slammed with high prices to convert. And so ultimately for someone like that, when it gets time to run a creator program, if they even are, they're going to be super picky with the type of creator that they're looking to hire, with the messaging, all of that. On the reverse side, you have like the pet industry, which I believe is the lowest CPA. So in that case, they'll probably be willing to test around, do a little more A/B testing, let the creator have their freedom. So, understanding the buyer and then setting objectives based on that information is so important. And then one of the biggest and most important things, I think, is understanding their target audience.
Sure.
Something I've been thinking about a lot recently is that I think a lot of marketers assume that creators are only good for B2C, which is definitely a big piece of it. But, with the rise of, let's say, LinkedIn, Top Voices, and even creators on other platforms, I actually represent a creator who is building the world's longest resume. So he goes to work with a different person every single day. Shout out Gabe if you're on the call. But, his audience is full of professionals, entrepreneurs, people who are tradesmen, small businesses, even CEOs. So, all of these people are business owners who require tools or tech solutions, CRMs, retail security. So there's a whole buyer pool that a business can target. And so, establishing who is the audience and then leveraging based on what your creator's capabilities are, I think is the most important thing that you can do.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Sam, I thought I'd kick it over to you to kind of come off with this question in terms of how do you align campaign goals between brands and your talent?
I think you said the magic word, alignment is key. And part of having really good alignment is managing expectations. I think it's also about adjusting your view, where a lot of this work between brands and creators can be very transactional. We have one campaign, let us know within 24 hours, does this fit, does it not? To me, I think there's a lot more room to ask questions, and you could still be quick, you could still be concise. A 5-minute phone call goes a really long way. So from our side, when working with creators, we want to be upfront with as many questions and as many objections, to be honest, with what the brand is looking for. So we want to find out, what are their expectations of goals? Because if they're expecting, a ton of conversions in the first post, and that's not something that typically happens, we want to tell them that, because we're not in this for one-off deals all the time. Of course, they're good, and we'll take them all that we can get. But like, we really want to build these relationships, and part of building that relationship is hitting our goals. So first we have to understand it, then we have to say, yes, we can do this, and then we actually have to execute on it. So I think that part's super important. And the way we can articulate that and align on those things is either with historical data or just with some like anecdotal evidence of like, hey, when we do this, this action happens. I think is super important.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Katie, similarly, What kind of, we're talking about, objectives and goals right now, and Sam did a great job in terms of like level setting, in terms of like what is actually feasible for an influencer. What do you feel are the most, I guess the biggest key elements that should be included in contracts between brands and influencers to kind of go a bit of a different route, but knowing that, we're trying to align, we're trying to be upfront in terms of like what's feasible. What kind of things do you think need to be included in order to ensure that both parties are, held accountable on both sides?
Yeah, for sure. So when it comes to agreeing on a scope, that should be done first, because you don't want to get to a place where you're getting into the red lines and they throw a new usage term out there and then they have the leverage because you didn't align on it previously. So, ensuring that all deliverables across all your platforms are clearly lined out. Don't forget link in bios or anything like that. Exclusivity usage, whether that's standard, paid, digital, full rights, which is a whole new different conversation, but if that were ever the case, and then I think one of the biggest levers within that, and goes back to understanding the industry you're working with, something I had mentioned a little bit before, is like exclusivity. In that case, if you're working with, let's say, a beauty brand, I can have NARS or MAC in my closet, and that does not at all reflect my loyalty to a brand. Every person in the world who has makeup has multiple brands. So really your exclusivity in that space should not be that high. And if it is, you should be pushing for compensation as such. Versus, back to the car example, you're really not driving 15 cars in the course of 6 months. So understanding that as well is very important. And then, in terms of contract terms, I think there's some that are more academic that are still important, but like indemnification, confidentiality. I won't bore with all of that, but I think it's important for any talent manager to understand those terms and, at least be working side by side with a lawyer to know the ins and outs of what you're agreeing to on behalf of your talent.
Yeah, that's fair. Oh, Sam, go ahead.
Okay. Katie, I think you're spot on. And it's something that I think comes up all the time, where it's one thing that we do wrong often, we as in the whole collective, is we get caught up in pricing issues around, video for price. But there's so many other non-financial sort of line items that could be part of the discussion, the negotiation, that can help your case, either for getting more money or for making the scope more appropriate for the given rate. And Katie, you listed out a bunch of those, right? There's like usage, exclusivity, indemnification. All of these components act as non-financial sort of terms that you can negotiate on and help build a case over time. And again, the quicker you can align on those things, the quicker you can get to working on the campaign together.
Yeah.
The one addition I would make that we haven't really touched on yet is sort of creative process and control and approvals and things like that. I mean, I've seen a lot of these projects not end well over issues like that. And in particular, again, wearing the media buyer hat, this is a shared media tactic. So the brand has to have enough confidence to say, we know who we are secure in our brand, and we are paying you for your brand and your following and your tone and your voice and your style and all the things that make you authentic. And if a brand is trying too hard to steer and to, force the language and to force the shot style and first of all, the creator is going to have a terrible experience. So it's harder to word that sort of thing, but I think the more clear you can set expectations of, here's what we're going to do, here's what we're not going to do, here, we're going to have one edit, one round of comments, no round of comments. Those are the things you end up having to really enforce, particularly if you have a brand decision maker who's challenging and is not used to sharing the stage. So it's more of a cautionary tale. I don't know exactly how to offer advice on like how to prevent this extremely well, but I think having some aspect of the contract speak to that process is really important.
Yeah, I agree.
No, I can chime in on how to prevent that, because I think, to your point, that is really where the conflict can come in. And I think, again, it kind of goes back to knowing the industry you're working with. For example, if you're working with a pharmaceutical company or a product, like a cleaning product with claims out the wazoo, you should probably suggest that one of the steps in the timeline is scripting, because if you're able to align, hopefully it doesn't get to a case where it's that prescriptive, but if it is because of the product you're promoting, make sure you understand that going into it, and your creator is okay with it, and then B, build out a script so that when it comes time to shoot, you have a term in your contract that says, no reshoot allowed unless they have not followed the creative brief or B, the script. And so I think that's a nice tactic you can use. Obviously, you want to be easy to work with, but if it is a super prescriptive campaign.
Yeah, that's fair. Katie, to kind of tie in with that, let's say you have a moment where conflict or disagreement comes up. Obviously, we all want to stay away from that, but things happen. And again, creative control, I think, can add to it. So do you have any suggestions other than, being very particular within the contract, and then also offering scripting to offer our attendees today in terms of like how they can handle these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, always go in with a nice attitude. I know that sounds a little
very true.
Cliche, but I think at the end of the day, this is influencer marketing and we're not saving lives. And so, I think always like to stress that. But then, being as proactive as you can. So if there's, ideally you've aligned on all of these things up front.
Right.
But if something has come up that you just couldn't expect, like it's a production shoot and it turned from a 3-hour day to a 6-hour day, there's always room to say, the same way if a creator doesn't follow their brief, well, if the brand doesn't follow what they've set forth either, fight for your creator. Everyone deserves compensation for what they've put in based on what was pre-originated. So I think if a brand can recognize like this is totally different than what was discussed initially, and they're able to find a way to, show that they appreciate that fact, usually I find that that's a great resolve. And if not, maybe the creator can say, hey, well, I've done X, Y, and Z, which was above what we agreed on. So, I'd love to take a little step back on this other piece in order to stay, within the scope that close to the scope that was initially agreed on. So I think it's always about like kind of lining out those line items of the scope and making it fair for everyone.
Yeah.
There's a few comments I had as well, but jump in some.
Yeah, please.
A quick example of something that I think, first of all, so many things can go wrong in an influencer campaign. And I think number one, it's like, how can you be direct, communicate early, and hopefully manage expectations? That's number one. But like, here's one specific example: was a brand was running an ad with one of our creators' content, and it's through their name. It was outside of the usage term. So I think it's really easy to be frustrated at first. And you want to send that email like, what the hell's going on over there? And like, we need to be paid for this and whatever. But I think it's important to really take a second and kind of lead with grace in some ways of like, hey, saw that you were running this ad. We'd love to discuss extending the usage term. Just so you know, this is outside the term and we usually charge for this. So let's talk about it. And I think that leads to better longer term partnerships. And so Noah, this is full disclosure, Noah and I have worked together, but I feel like this was something that we discovered in like the path of trust with clients, where when something goes wrong, and if you're able to solve that together in a collaborative way, you only get more trust with that client or partner, where you can kind of continue the relationship in a much better way. So I think it's always about over communicating, being somewhat direct, but also leading with like information as opposed to frustration or anger.
Yeah, no, that's beautifully said.
Thank
I'd
you.
love to add one more thing to that, Sam. I think, oh, Noah, you had mentioned you had something to say, so why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, I've written a lot of contracts for a lot of things over the years. And ultimately, I feel like there's two realms. Like one realm is just person to person communication, setting expectations, trying to prevent those issues by all the words we've been talking about: alignment, communication, proactivity, etc. And then there's this other realm where like things have escalated, you've tried to de-escalate, it becomes contentious. You never want to like then just point at the contract and say, well, you signed this, like that's not ever going to end in a good outcome. So my personal take is contracts are legally binding. Conversations are more like the eye contact handshake that relationships are built on. I feel like you want to have the contract, and then you want to discuss it, and you want to build alignment, and you want to kind of swallow the frog and like face maybe the most ambiguous or most potentially problematic areas head on and just say, look, should we cross this bridge? Like we've thought about it ahead of time. And then if you do a good job of all that prep work, then if a problem occurs, you're not in uncharted territory. You say, well, we actually discussed that this could happen and now it's happening. And now we can kind of work through the process we had already discussed. If you don't do that, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure type preventative thinking, things escalate. And now you're putting in a contract and the person's like, I don't care what the contract says. You said something else. I have a problem with what you said. So if it's about your reputation, that's different than if you're litigious and you're planning on taking someone to court. Like really you want to live in the world of proactivity and prevention and de-escalation. And the contract is just there in that Luke case that it actually escalates very far.
Yeah, that's great. Great point. Katie, go ahead and jump in.
It's a perfect point to lead into what I was thinking, which is that, ultimately the brand is usually the one who has something more to add. And so as for any of like the talent managers on this call, the best way to be able to face a conversation, like Noah mentioned, whether it's before, during, or after, is by knowing your talent inside and out. If you know their barriers before you begin, that's the best way to avoid a conflict because, like Noah mentioned, there's always going to be a conversation and a way to agree as long as there's no major red flag for the talent. But let's say a talent hates voiceover because every time their content crashes and that's their sticking point and that's the thing that's going to make them very, upset about being pushed in a certain direction. As a talent manager, your job is to know that about them and be able to already predict if that campaign, if there's any chance that they might change the direction to be with a voiceover. So, I think it's also just understanding what those major no-go zones are for your talent and building up that knowledge over time so that you go in as best of a representative as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, time is flying and again, looking at the questions, we're just knocking them out. So I want to kind of jump down a little bit and talk about tools. And Noah, I'd love to come to you. What tools and platforms do you recommend that you feel could help in tracking and presenting performance metrics for, a talent manager, an influencer themselves, a brand, of course, anyone like that?
So I'm just going to be really forthright. I was a buyer of these services more than 3 years ago, and I don't want to pretend that I'm right on the front edge of, there's new platforms popping up all the time. So I'm assuming that things are still pretty much the same, but I'm not going to like name drop specifically because I'm guessing the landscape has shifted.
Sure.
But ultimately, I think what it comes down to is tracking and attribution. So if someone's posting an organic post to their TikTok following, their LinkedIn following for B2B, Instagram, etc., you're kind of stuck using in-platform metrics. If you end up doing one of these sort of co-published posts where the brand is promoting, but it's whitelisted, okay, well now you're going to unlock all of the paid metrics. And then ideally, if you work with a platform, a tech partner that can facilitate some of this, you either publish through their platform, and then there's additional data that can be tracked, or you're publishing with a link and there's tracking code tied to the link. So I'm more just zooming out over the landscape, but essentially categorically, you're either doing organic only, and pretty much platform metrics is what you've got. So that's going to be, did we hit our reach expectation? Did we get our engagement, whether it's rate or quality or whatever? If there's paid media behind it, you're going to get way more trackable data, just because the paid tools, it's exhaustive. Anything that can be tracked will be tracked. And then if there's click tracking involved, that's where you can really change what's possible. I want to touch a little bit on where I think there's a white space in the market. And I know Sam and I have talked about this a lot. So, one of the things that we do at Popsixle is we've built a click tracking product, not for influencer, but for just ad attribution. And what's totally feasible today is you can look at all of your purchases and essentially say which ones can be tied back to this tactic or that tactic or this third tactic. And even if it's not, crystal clear one-to-one attribution, you can, from an infallible perspective, say, we got 1,000 purchases, and I'm certain that these 100 had something to do with that link click, because I can see that link click ties back. That's really, really awesome. And that kind of changes the game of quantifying value. Where I've been really disappointed, and I think probably a lot of people in the industry can agree, is right now sort of I wouldn't say it's the best technology, but the most common technology is using discount codes. So if the influencer will say, buy the sneakers and use discount code my name 2234, to save 30%. Well, now you've given up 30% of your revenue just for attribution. And you're probably going to give the influencer a cut of the sales as well. All of a sudden your pie slice is getting, they're getting really, really small. So it's unfortunate that there's such a gap around click tracking that it ends up leading to, literally giving up 10, 20, 30% of your revenue just so that you can encourage users to use the code, just so that you can attribute it.
Yeah.
I didn't answer your question, but I think it's
Yes,
speaking in that space.
it does, definitely. And maybe just to follow up with that, you kind of touched on it already, but do you have any other suggestions on how brands and influencers can collaborate on that data sharing point to really improve outcomes overall?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be a baseline of trust. I'm probably being a little bit presumptuous when I say this, but I think that this is the Achilles heel of the industry. So I think that a lot of influencers probably don't want to openly talk about how the value they're creating is really hard to quantify. So if there's not a base level of trust, what I would love to see is for, the professional marketing team, the brand, and the influencer, right? All three stakeholders to sit down and just be really honest and say, look, here's what we consider success to be. Here's how we want to be able to measure that. If we just do table stake stuff, that's not going to work. We need to do more. Let's figure this out. How can we do this? But in order for the influencer to sit at that table, they have to be willing to admit, if I'm just selling on estimated impressions, that's not good enough. And I think that someone who's insecure is going to have a defense mechanism that kind of protects from that feeling of maybe shame or falling short. And this is the elephant in the room for the whole industry from my perspective. So I think you just have to face it head on. And I think you have to build that shared equity and saying, if we can figure this out, we are more likely to have a repeatable win-win-win where this is one of many projects and we all sell off into the sunset. And if you have those aligned downstream outcomes, hopefully then people can feel safe enough, emotionally safe enough to say, all right, let's be vulnerable for a second. In the past, this didn't go as well as it could have. We all want to do better. Let's put our heads together. Yes, I can share the credentials to my account, or I'm willing to share screenshots, or, you give me the 10K, I'll run the paid media, or whatever the solution is. But there really needs to be a willingness to kind of work together, because it is very tricky. And again, I think when people feel bad, they're less willing to sit at that table and talk openly.
Yeah. If I could jump in with one quick point. I spend way too much time thinking about the Ulmer scale. which may sound like foreign, but we've all heard of it. You've heard of A-list actors, B-list actors, C-list. That started as a scale to rank bankability. For if you put this actor in this movie, you can expect X amount of money return. Now it's more of like a social thing. So in the influencer space, it lacks that sort of credential or sort of consistent flow against all brands or all agencies. Like everyone kind of has their own mix of things. So we could look at that as a negative, or we turn it into a positive, which is how can we take back control of measuring these things or being proactive about capturing this data? No, that would be an ideal situation if they gave the influencer the money to run the paid ads and then we can run that. That's often not the case. So how can we put in sort of these objectives or projects where we can generate that data ourselves and track it? For example, you have a Discord community, you have a blog, or you have different ways to show that you've taken your audience and migrated them elsewhere, where you have a little bit more transparency into that. I'm all for like taking back the control. How can we sort of own that process and showcase that we are driving our audience to do things?
Absolutely. Well, we are getting close to the top of the hour, and I see that we have quite a few questions in, so I wanted to go through a couple of those. I thought I could just start from the top, and please feel free to jump in as you best see fit. I thought this one was very interesting, as all of them are, but this individual said they saw a lot of proof that conversion rates on creator-led campaigns really supersede those on any SEM or SEO opportunities. However, sometimes CMOs still seem hesitant to allocate more budget toward creators. So their question was, what are the frequent objections, you've seen from those CMOs, and how do you manage them to kind of figure out, the best way to move forward?
I'll jump in with a quick sort of thought there. I think it goes back to the idea that there isn't that one source of truth of how to measure this or how to prove this effectiveness. So it's a little bit lacking to say, hey, this was valuable and we should keep investing in it. At the same time, I think there's a ton of really bad influencer sort of campaigns and strategies going on where it isn't an effective channel for these brands or agencies. And I think one thing that's missing from that process, and I'm so sorry for this horrible metaphor, but I think brands need to use the full chicken. So it's like when you cook a chicken, there's the meat, there's all the other things, and then there's the bones. Like, how do you use the bones when you're done eating the meat? Do you put it in water and make some broth with it? And I guess that metaphor in my head translates to, are you working with these creators to contact their audience? How are you using their audience data, whether it's in a paid essence where you can now target them or in an organic sense? Are you using their assets across different media channels? To me, I think CMOs would see value from this if they started using creator-generated content in their TV commercials or in their programmatic ads or, out of home. How do you create like a localized campaign in every mall with out of home sort of billboards with creators from those cities? In the store? Why are we still using models? Why are we still using these people who don't have these audiences? I think brands and agencies would save money on it. I think that they would be more effective. And I think that would help blow sort of this influencer world like a little bit out of what it is now. But I'm hopeful that it'll get there.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry. One example is like everyone knows the Burger King commercials now. And that's like Ty Verde's song where he started on TikTok. They now put it in all their commercials. They use social content. I think they've done a really good job of that, Burger King. So just one quick example.
Yeah, it's a great note for everyone. If you haven't seen it, definitely look that one up. Another question, it's more so from the creator front, but this individual said, how do brands value content compared to following? They mentioned, they take a lot of pride in their quality of content. However, they don't have a huge following. And they really want to stand their ground within their work and, showcasing their creativity. But again, sometimes that means maybe not as many campaigns come to them or the conversation is a little bit different. But I'd be curious to hear from everyone's perspective on, how we feel that is different. Do they need to have a large following in order to be part of these, or can the quality of their content really stand out?
I mean, I think there's usually, again, if we talk about different dimensions and scale is just one dimension, I think scale usually most directly equates to cost.
Mhm.
And in some ways, you just have to kind of right size. Like there's such a big industry at this point, you know, a Kardashian tweet is going to be extremely highly priced, whereas maybe a really niche creator with a really impassioned following that only has a few thousand followers, you know, whether you call it micro influence or whatever you want to call it, you know, that's not going to, you're not going to be cross shopping those two options. Like those are completely different ends of the spectrum. So I think in some ways, the same way that, you know, as marketers, we're trying to figure out who to work with, I think the creators have to market themselves and say, all right, well, based on my reach, based on my quality, based on my audience, who should I be working with, and what is the right size, and how do I price it accordingly? And if I were a CMO and I had 100K to spend, do I spend 100K on a one relationship, or do I spend 1,000 on 100 relationships? Those are both good viable options. So that's what it makes me think of, is it's sort of right sizing and figuring out, you know, the cost versus the scale versus the complexity.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. Oh, go ahead, Katie.
I think also to that point, you know, understanding the buyer's usage, you know, if they're looking for something really visually appealing for their owned and operated channels, and they're looking for, you know, digital usage and whatnot, they might not necessarily care. Or if they're simply, you know, maybe it's a UGC play where they're running paid only. So, you know, knowing your strengths, kind of to Noah's point in that regard, and marketing yourself appropriately. Maybe you're calling yourself a UGC creator. And knowing where your content holds the most value is super important.
Great. I think we have time for one last question, and I thought this would be a good one to wrap it up. This individual said, how often do you have success in doing outbound work for your talents versus opportunities coming to them? Now, I know that's a little bit out of your realm, but feel free to interject there as well. But Katie and Sam, I thought it was a good one for you.
Yeah.
I think Katie and I talk about this daily, of like, what's the best strategy?
Mhm.
How are you going out to these people? For outbound, I think it's test and learn. It's one part getting yourself out there. As a talent manager, I think it's important to find creators who have good existing business and inbound contacts. And then as the manager, my value is helping them manage that and hopefully scale that up so they could either charge more for similar stuff or add on to it. So it's a longer term partnership. I think it's like mixed success in outbound. I think you have to go into outbound cold calls with that mindset of like, I'm going to get 9 doors shut in my face to hopefully have one open up. And then what happens when they open it up? Hopefully that one's successful. But I think it's about having a really good plan to do it at scale, less so personalized. But then when you do get on the phone, how do you tailor it to each brand individually to really try and show the value?
Yeah, good point. Well,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
I think you know, having outbound as a part of a manager's scope is very important. I know some managers will say, like, I don't pitch. You know, I don't know why, but whether it's inbound or outbound, you know, on the other hand, I think maybe creators will say, well, if it's inbound, like I already got the deal, so where's the manager's value? I think both of those are a little bit extreme viewpoints. And so, you know, with, let's say, an inbound, there's so much strategy to go into that. Like, was it from a brand direct or a brand agency? And personally, my negotiation and strategy around working with brand direct or brand agency is totally different, whether it was inbound or outbound. So, you know, I know we're at time, but that's another conversation I'd be happy to have with anyone.
No, I appreciate that. It sounds like we have a lot to follow up on. But again, I respect everyone's time. The hour flew by and this conversation was wonderful. I think we touched on a lot of hot topics, and hopefully all attendees can walk away with a new piece of nugget that they hadn't heard before. But to wrap things up, I just wanted to say thank you to our panelists, to Noah, to Katie, to Sam. Thank you for joining us today and having this conversation. You can find each individual on LinkedIn. And for us, I mean, we would love for you to join us over on our Facebook and LinkedIn groups under the FYI by Find Your Influence. We talk about a variety of topics that are focused within influencer marketing. So conversations like these happen over there as well. We are an influencer marketing company with a self-service solution, but we also offer white glove managed service. So if anyone is looking for support in their next campaign, we're here to support you. And stay tuned for next month's webinar on August 7th. We're going to be talking about harnessing the power of influencer marketing with service-based brands. I hope everyone has a wonderful morning and afternoon, and appreciate everyone's time. And we will be talking with you all very soon.